Well, for more on what all these meetings and hearings mean for trade between China and the United States, I'm joined by Jacques deLisle. He's a professor of law and political science, as well as the director for the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So looking at the expectations going into these meetings, what are both sides hoping to achieve in this round of talks?
Well, I think there's a range of objectives. Given how badly the U.S. delegation visit to Beijing went, I think just avoiding things coming off the rails is a major step forward. I think it's going to be a long-term process. We've heard a lot since Liu He arrived in Washington about how far apart the two sides are. So I think we're still in a phase of negotiations where there are a lot of issues on the table. We've heard some possibility of trading off the ZTE sanctions for a deal in agriculture. That's possible. I think we can expect to see some commitments, perhaps not in this round, but fairly soon, on greater market opening by China. Obviously, the question of how much the U.S. will restrict certain tech exports to China or will impose restrictions on Chinese investments in the U.S., those are the issues that are on the table. I wouldn't be too hopeful about great breakthroughs on this trip, however.
Now, ahead of the talks, we saw that China's Vice Premier Liu He met with Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor to then-President Nixon, when he opened relations with mainland China in the early 1970s. What's the significance of this meeting with Kissinger?
Well, it's a bit hard to know. I think there is, as you know, a sense in China of there are old friends, right? And Kissinger is about as old a friend as China has in the United States, both in terms of how old he is, but also, of course, because he was present at the beginning of the opening of U.S.-China relations. So I think there's that, but I think it's also very good optics. We're at a moment when there is more concern than we've seen in a long time about serious damage being done to what has been a pretty stable and relatively a positive relationship, and Kissinger is kind of a symbol of how deep this is and how much is potentially at stake if we see serious damage to bilateral relations. And finally, I think there's a sense that Kissinger may be one way of getting through to the Trump administration. We've seen this before since Trump was elected, where Kissinger was targeted as somebody who could perhaps convey messages back and forth. And he is a singularly respected individual in U.S.-China relations from both sides.
And in that same vein, we see that negotiations kick off with Thursday's meeting with U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, rather than some of these China hardliners like White House economic advisor Peter Navarro. What's the benefit or the challenge that come with starting the talks this way?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with someone who's going to be somewhat more cooperative, and I think some of the sequencing, of course, is done by the U.S. side, and although the politics of the Trump administration are not terribly transparent either. The reporting we've been getting in recent days is that the relatively less hardline faction, people like Mnuchin, people like Larry Kudlow, appear to have been gaining in influence relative to Navarro and Lighthizer and others who are tougher on China. So I would take that as a good sign.
Now, we know there's been lots of rhetoric from Capitol Hill recently against Chinese companies like Huawei and, of course, as you mentioned, ZTE. So why has that become such a make-or-break issue in this?
Well, I think one of the reasons it's been thrust into prominence is, of course, what the president has said about it. But I think it, in a way, is a lightning rod for a lot of issues here. For those in the U.S. who are very skeptical about how the Trump administration approaches trade relations and economic relations with China, the ZTE issue is disturbing. And so you will hear people say, quite rightly, that we generally do not trade off national security concerns against economic concerns in a trade negotiation. And of course, the sanctioning of ZTE was based on the violation as the U.S. found, of export restrictions to Iran and North Korea. And of course, it's bundled with broader complaints one has heard in the U.S. that ZTE's equipment might be a mechanism whereby U.S. government sources could perhaps be hacked and spied upon. So there's that whole thing from the U.S. side. And I think from the Chinese side, the concern has been that this looks like a real death penalty move, a very big stick being wielded against ZTE in a way that essentially threatened to kill the company, and that it looks like discrimination against Chinese entities, which are scrutinized more closely than other foreign investors in the U.S. And of course, in China, it's become sort of a focus of some nationalist concern and resentment that this is sort of an example of the U.S. perhaps trying to keep China down, or at least showing that even a very large Chinese company like ZTE is dependent on the import of U.S. components to make some of its core products.
So to that point then, what role do the needs of businesses, consumers and workers on both sides play out in how bilateral relations develop?
Well, I think you're seeing some of that right now. Earlier in your report today, you talked about the current comments that are going on with respect to the tariffs that would be imposed in the sort of first major round of sanctions here. And this is a case where the business community, much of it is making very loud noises about the impact it will have on their interests. Now, of course, there are some U.S. businesses that will benefit from the tariffs, but many that will lose, and we're hearing from both. Another piece of the story in the United States is very much about consumers and what tariffs will do to consumer costs. The jobs issue, of course, has been played here primarily as a matter of pushing back against Chinese exports because it will supposedly keep jobs from going to China. That's often exaggerated, but that too has the other side of the coin, where we've seen President Trump pointing to the export opportunities that are lost by the ZTE sanctions. So there's that whole complex alignment here. And on the Chinese side, of course, one of the things that puts this on the top of the Chinese policy agenda, as far as we can tell, is that it was going to put a lot of people who work for ZTE out of work, and that's a big deal.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Jacques deLisle from the University of Pennsylvania.